Hello. Thank you both for joining us. Our third participant is stuck in an airport or on a plane at this moment. So so thank you, Sandra, for having the foresight to invite three people, because the standard rule applies as ever, you know.
So who do you expect to come to this event?
We had about how many registrants did we have, Catherine? And it was, the invites were geared toward faculty, but also we expect to have some grad students sign up.
First thing this morning we had 20 people. Now we have 33. So we usually see half that number come through. But since this was the day of, we got quite a number more participants. We might see a group anywhere between 20 and 25 today. So that would be really nice.
And a lot of the promotion was done by Catherine through the Center for Ideas in Society. So we did do some more general promotion as well through the internal newsletter. But so,
Catherine, are you guys having any events in person at all?
We are. It's an interesting mix now, about 50-50 or maybe 30-30-30. Some are hybrid. That's the part that's the most difficult, I think, to have it be a meaningful experience, both recorded and in person, because we just really don't have the technology to capture those speaking events in the rooms that we have. The lighting's so poor, right? So I think they're really strong in person or really strong virtual. We're just that hybrid piece where we're trying to cope with the trying to come up to speed, I suppose, and become technology experts. And I'm slow going on that. So
No, I agree, because Writers Week hybrid just didn't work at all. You know, there were 3 events that were in person, and one was me, Charmaine, and the tribute to Mike Davis. So we had maybe about 30 people in the audience, and then you had this big group hybrid, and going back and forth didn't work at all because the technology kept messing up, and then you have to pause. And then people got frustrated because what they could see on the screen was Tom Lutz trying to fix it, which poor Tom, he was trying to fix it. But you guys know how difficult it is. I think in person is what students want right now, for sure. So, yeah.
It does seem as though folks are comfortable with one or the other. It's tricky to try to combine them at this point. So. So if it's okay with everyone, I'll start the slideshow that will be running when we turn on the webinar or open the doors. Feel free to leave your cameras on. And then once John starts talking, we'll probably give it, I guess, John, a minute or two for people to sign on. And then once John starts talking, I'll turn the slideshow off. I'll be hovering here in the background, but it'll be all your show at that point.
thank you so much for all the work you've done to get this set up, Catherine. Really appreciate it a lot. And thank you as well, Sandra.
Yeah, welcome. I'm gonna turn off my camera and let the 3 of you shine. See you.
And Sandra, I hope you'll jump in whenever you like.
Sure, thank you.
Just checking, you're seeing the full screen of the slideshow, is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Will you give me a prompt when it's time to go, or are people
I'm opening the doors. You go when it's ready. If you just want to let folks know we'll wait a minute or two, then you just take it from there.
Okay. The doors are opening. Folks, we're waiting for people to trickle in here, so we will welcome, and we will start in just about a minute. Thanks for joining us. Hey, thank you to everyone who's joined us here today. And thank you so much to our panelists, Harry Link and Susan Straight, both of whom have a lot of experience writing and publishing opinion articles and essays in some of our leading publications. And so we're really glad for the insights that they can provide to you throughout the session. I'm John Warren. I'm the Director of News and Content for recently renamed University Relations for University Communications. Our third panelist, Victoria Reyes, is unfortunately not able to join us. She is in an airport, I think in the air as we speak. But we're awfully glad for our other two panelists who join us today. I'm going to start off with what is for me a tricky technical maneuver, and that is trying to share a screen here. So I'm going to cross my fingers and hope. Do you see something that says writing op-eds on your screen?
Yes.
Wonderful. All right. Great. So this is just, I just want to do a real quick kind of run through, and I'm very glad for anyone in the room who would like a more thorough walkthrough of the structure of writing an op-ed, getting into the nuance. Please feel free to just send me a message and I can coordinate a session with you one-on-one, or Sandra Martinez, who's in the room, would also be glad to just send an email to news@ucr.edu and we will connect with you. Here's just a really quick run through, and you see a quote here at the top. It says, if you say things of consequence, there may be consequences, but the alternative is to be inconsequential. And that's from Katie Orenstein, who was the founder of the op-ed project. The op-ed project was founded, I'm going to say about 15 years ago, with the idea of increasing the presence of women specifically on the op-ed pages. At that point, the presence of female authors on the op-ed pages was something like 10 or 12%. Today, it's more like heading toward 40%. And so I don't know if the op-ed project can claim all the credit for that, but things are certainly changing on the op-ed pages. And so it's a great trend to see. I've got some sort of odds and ends advice here in terms of, and I'm glad, again, send me an email if you'd like to get the PDF of this, news@ucr.edu, and just talks a little bit about how to get their attention. There is a lot of structure in terms of how you can hope to make a successful pitch to an op-ed page editor. There is also, in terms of the follow-up, their expectations, of bothering them the right amount, but not too much. Here's something, a lot of people, why bother writing op-eds? A lot of you, if you're attending this workshop, you probably already have straightened this, sort of set this in your mind about why it's worth your time and effort. But, it obviously increase your exposure to your academic expertise. It's gonna help you make connections academically. It's going to even help lead to more citations for you. You can have a great opportunity to inform and influence policy. We see this. I'd be glad if Perry and Susan have any anecdotal information to share in the session. to this point, but I've definitely witnessed where people have, writers of op-eds have felt really satisfied that they got their voice out there and felt that there was a lot of potential to influence, if not the policy, certainly the discussion around the policy. Of course, it's good for UCR, good for UCR to have your name out there and have UCR's name out there influencing these topics of discussion. And this is how large scale media placements, any media placements and op-ed placements, this is how you get out there as an expert in your field. For all of our efforts in our unit, the best thing we can do is help to facilitate a placement in a large in a media outlet with large reach, because that is how the next media folks are going to find you. And we find this time and time again. We get one really good second tier media placement, and suddenly we get 2 or 3 top tier media inquiring to place stories, to put your voice in their articles. Again, quickly here, structure of an op-ed. There really is can be a real formula to this. There is a real formula that works once you know what you're doing. As with any rules with writing, once you know the rules, you're in the best position to break the rules. And so I'm sure our op-ed writers today probably don't follow this very strictly, but it is a good format. And one of the great things about it is that when an op-ed page editor sees you following this format, they know that you've taken the time to research what they're looking for. Word count, of course, is very important too. They used to, but it varies by publication. It certainly has changed now that we have a lot of op-eds being published only in digital format. But they used to say as little as 600 words. I find few outlets now want as few as 600 words, but certainly as a general guideline, by the time you get to about 800 words, you should probably see some warning lights flashing, because we're getting to where they're gonna want to trim you. And if you're way out of their range, I've had editors communicate to me that's as good a reason as any to pass on your submission, because they feel you're not in touch with what they're looking for. Why follow the structure in terms of the email? It's that they're getting an incredible volume of submissions, particularly at the major news outlets, and they're looking for reasons to say no, because they've just got a numbers game that is not in their favor. So if you play by the rules, it greatly increases the chances that you're going to get the look that you want to get for it. You can lead with, there's a number of different ways to lead. Personal experience is a great one. An anecdote that hooks people's attention is another one. Most op-eds successfully pitched are relevant to the news cycle, which means they're really timely. And I'll ask our panelists today to speak to that. And by that, it means you have to turn it around generally a lot more quickly than is comfortable. Shocked, leading off a story by I always remember Carl Trainer, who's on a philosophy professor here, led an op-ed that was published in the LA Times a few years ago by saying that a chemical corporation was treating children like canaries in a coal mine. And that's the sort of thing that it's hard not to read the next paragraph after reading that. Acknowledge counter arguments when you write, and address those and find a way, preferably, to dismiss them. And then circle back to the lead. It's often a trick with good writing is, come back to the point you made, reaffirm the point that you're making through the article, preferably really have one theme that you're trying to push here. Don't divert into multiple directions. Again, perspectives itself here. It's great to have a personal connection. Great to be tied to the news cycle. If you've got new research coming out, that's a good reason. If there's an anniversary coming up related to your area of interest or research, that's a good occasion. 25th, 50th anniversary. There is a link. There's a lot of really good resources on the op-ed project.org page. End of my sharing. Also, I want to say that in university communications, again, feel free to just use that news@ucr.edu email address. We're glad to help you through the whole process. If you have an idea for an op-ed, or if you've taken a first shot at it and you just want to share it with us, we're glad to read through your draft, or we're glad to hear what you're thinking about, help you sort of, if you need help getting to one core point that you want to make, we're glad to help you there. Give you some guidelines, including on length. Then we're glad to read through the first draft and offer you some edits and some suggestions. We'll even help you pitch. Sometimes the best way to pitch is to skip the public information officer and pitch yourself. Oftentimes that's the case. And I suspect that I'll ask that of Perry and Susan, and I suspect their answer at this point is certainly that they go directly, they have contacts. I'll start with Perry. Perry, was that always the case? Do you, now you have a lot of contacts, is that right? Was that different at the beginning of your journey in writing op-eds?
It was different, yes. At first, I would send them into the standard mailbox at the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or wherever it is. And normally they would ask to wait up to 4 days. And if you don't hear from us, that's a no. So I would, and then I'd try another one and stuff. As I placed a few, though, and got to know the editors themselves and worked back and forth with them, sometimes editors can be very helpful, actually, in jogging me, and grabbing me by the shoulders and saying, that's not clear enough, make it clearer, or add this, or take out that. And so I get to know them. And when I get to know them, then the next time I send it straight to them, they usually, it still takes a day or two, but then I get an answer.
Let me put that to Susan. Susan, I know, I'm sure you have a lot of contacts, I know at the LA Times and elsewhere. Do you, have you always gone it alone in terms of pitching, or has that been an evolution over time?
Well, first I wanted to say, I'm not sure if we have a chat function, but it's always helpful to know what this audience would like to hear about. And I'm not sure we got introduced, but I'm Distinguished Professor Susan Straight from Creative Writing. And this is my 35th year here at UCR, and I find that things have changed a lot, which is interesting. In the beginning, the LA Times op-ed and the New York Times op-ed, as Perry knows, had many more pages. You might have had 3 or 4 pages of op-eds. Washington Post op-ed has always been, was always big too, as well as the Wall Street Journal. In the beginning, I was a journalism major. So interestingly enough, having gone to USC and then having come to work at UCR, there were lots of people that I would reach out to in various publications. So I've published in the New York Times, the LA Times, Harper's. The Atlantic does mostly online things, as John mentioned. There are so many different venues for you all. If you're looking at essays, personal essay with a topical hook is something I teach my graduate students. And I think I've probably had 10 to 15 former graduate students or current graduate students published in the LA Times or the Washington Post. And those are, much as John Warren said, those are very specific pieces. I had one former graduate student publish about her husband's opioid overdose in the LA Times. And that was a really hard piece to write. We worked on it for a long time, but that was a great piece. My last 4 or 5 pieces in the LA Times, there's a varying cast of editors, for example, at the Los Angeles Times op-ed pages. And yes, I do know them by this point, but I think one of your best ways is to contact one of your professors or your colleague. If you're a student, maybe your professor. If you're a colleague and you contact me and say, hey, do you think this is good for the LA Times? I'm always happy to introduce somebody. For the New York Times, they have such a rotating cast, don't they, Perry? The editors for the New York Times op-ed cycle in and out. So yeah, I'll get to know someone and I'll know them for 4 years, and then they'll cycle out and work in a different section of the New York Times. My editor right now at the New York Times op-ed is the deputy editor, and the amount of emails she gets are insane. So I was going to say, in addition to what John's talking about, making sure it's clear, it's so hard to get an answer, within 2 or 3 days, unless you know someone. It's really difficult. The same goes for the Wall Street Journal. But one thing I do always tell my colleagues, and as well as people I meet at book festivals, for example, the paperback for my new novel, Mecca, comes out this week. So there are lots of reasons to write an op-ed, but I tend to only write an op-ed if it's something I really feel passionate about. And so when Joan Didion passed away, someone reached out immediately to me and said, would you like to write about that? And I did, and that was one of the most popular op-ed pieces for the LA Times that year. But my beloved colleague, Mike Davis, passed away this year, and at least 5 editors reached out to me, and I couldn't write about that because I'm too close to Mike Davis, and I felt too strongly and too deeply to be able to write something that fit into 1,000 words. So I think my main piece of advice, and I don't know what you think, Perry, is if you feel really strongly emotional about something and you're really attached to it. I love to write about this area, but I loved in the past to write about my kids being of mixed race, how it was to raise them. I have a new piece coming out about Robert Frank, the famous American photographer. And that's because all of the things that Robert Frank wrote about being on the road in America are so true for people now, even now. So I think, John, the best advice is to, if you feel very passionate about something, that's a good thing. And then if you have something very clear, of course, it's my dog weighing in. If you have something very clear to say, that's the best way to go about it, I think, is that you have something no one else has. That's what I always tell my student. Even that one student who wrote about her husband, no one else could have told that story the way Lauren Malden did about finding her husband in the throes of an overdose.
Really enjoyed your, if you have a chance to Google Susan's article that she wrote on Joan Didion, that was really enjoyed that, Susan, a lot. So we do have in the chat field here, as Susan referenced, please, if you have questions, just as we're going along, just pop them in there and I will see them, and then I will hand them off to our panelists. I also see some folks like Marion Lamb and Kathy Gaitis, who I'm sure have some op-ed writing experience, who may have some things to share as well, and others among you. So feel free to put in your remarks here if you have some information you'd like us to the group to see. Looks like we've got about 25 folks in our house today. I will belatedly and very quickly offer a couple bios here. I don't want to embarrass our panelists with long bios, but I do want to make a mention here of both of their backgrounds. We really, I'm so glad that both of them are able to join us, and we've got so much to bring to this conversation. Perry Link is a South Carolina native who has his PhD in history and East Asian languages from Harvard University. He is a professor of East Asian Studies Emeritus from Princeton, having been a professor of East Asian Studies at Princeton from 1989 to 1998, an assistant professor and lecturer from 1973 to 1977. He is at UCR Chancellorial Chair for Teaching Across Disciplines.
That's enough, John. Let's not use time on this kind of stuff.
Okay. Well, I'll just finish by saying he's written op-eds about China for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and LA Times. So thank you, Barry, for joining us. Susan is a native of Riverside and a distinguished professor of creative writing at UC Riverside. She's been here since 1998. Her new novel, Mecca, was a finalist for the Purpose Prize and named by the New York Times as a top 10 California Book of the Year. Her stories and essays and opinion articles have appeared in the New York Times, the New Yorker, and Harper's. She's a regular commentary on NPR's All Things Considered. Again, thank you to both of you for for being with us today. Harry, I'd like to jump over to something prior to the meeting you shared with me, some 5 points that you'd like to make here. One of those points is the importance of timeliness in terms of the news cycle. Can you speak to how important that is, how important timing is when you're pitching an op-ed?
Frankly, I would say that's of secondary importance. I would start with what Susan was just saying about feeling passionate about what you want to say. You have to have something that's important to you to say and important to readers to read. You might have had an experience, as your outline there suggests, that makes you think of an issue. Say you're a Chinese American and somebody insults you on the street out of Asian hate or something. That's the kind of thing that might grab you and you want to write about. You shouldn't, though, make it just about what happened to you. An op-ed editor doesn't want to see what happened to Susan Straight or Perry Link, and that's it. You need to relate it to a wider issue, which in this imaginary case I gave you would be the issue of this kind of racist Asian hate that pops up. But then you don't want to just say the obvious either. Say something that is new to you and you think will be new to the audience. For example, you're a Chinese American and somebody comes along and says, "Get off the sidewalk, chink," or something. And that person is going to be surprised that what she or he did actually makes you sympathize more with the Communist Party of China, which is probably what that person doesn't want. So you can make that point. You can say, gee, when this happened to me, this made me feel more eager to go reach out to Xi Jinping than I would have been otherwise, so that it's new. But having said all that, I think it's important, once you're inspired and have your point thought of, to be sure you put yourself in the reader's position. I mean, you can be all wound up about your own feelings, but if you start from there, the reader's not going to follow you. So you have to think of, what does the reader know and not know, and explain the problem from that point of view. I'll rush to one more point that I bet Susan agrees with it, but I'll go ahead and throw it out there. Don't try to be defensive and use a whole bunch of academic jargon to make yourself look or feel authoritative. And just to illustrate this, I made up an example here that I'll read fairly quickly for you. Say you're a Korean American and somebody insults you on the street for being Asian, and you wrote this: "The proliferation of anti-Asian hate in the public spaces of California communities leaves individuals vulnerable to a stereotyping that conflates their origins with those of others whose physical features are superficially comparable." And that says it all. That's your meaning, but that is dull as hell to a reader. Write it this way instead. "I was walking down the street on a sunny day in Alhambra when a guy on a motorbike pulls up, hops off, and pushes me to the ground, shouting, 'Go home, chink.' Trouble is, I'm Korean American." And that is concrete, it's dramatic, it shows where you're coming from, and a reader's going to latch on much more easily. Tying it to the news, yes, but for me, that's always a secondary thing. I'll have some point I want to make and an anecdote to illustrate it. And by the way, John, your warning there in your own outline of giving credit to the other side is important too. Your argument in the long run is going to be stronger if you acknowledge what the other view is and show why still you think your view is better. That's much better than ignoring the other side. But getting long-windedly here to your question about tying it to the news, what I do is think of something and write it, and I might have it in my computer memory ready to go. And then we'll look for some way to hook it to the news. My latest piece, which is going to come out in the Wall Street Journal in a week or two, was that way. I thought of it long ago. It's about the possibility that the US State Department would recognize formally the government in Taiwan. And this is a big controversial issue, of course, and it's a long-term issue. It's a sleeper issue that really could come out anytime. But I tied it originally to the 50th anniversary of Richard Nixon's going to Shanghai and signing the original accords that established Chinese-American relations. I thought that was a great hook. And I did it, but I tried it at the New York Times and it got rejected. And I tried it at the Washington Post and it got rejected. I tried it at the Wall Street Journal and it got accepted. But by that time, that hook was gone. We'd already passed that. So it's now still sleeping there. And I'm waiting for another hook to come along. And so is the editor, by the way. And we'll see. If it comes, that's good. It's always better, right, if you can tie it to the news cycle. In fact, the editor in his last email to me said, all right, this is all set and we're ready to do it. And it'll come out in a week or two, unless Taiwan jumps into the news, in which case it'll come out sooner.
Perfect example. Yeah, that's what we so often find is if we do miss the news cycle, if it's an episode that's in the news, it's probably going to come back around. It might be a couple of weeks, it might be 6 months, but it's going to come back around. And then the tactic is be ready to freshen up your lead on it and tie it to whatever came into the cycle. Then the article that I referenced earlier with Carl Trainer was actually an op-ed that we did not get published in the LA Times, but then it got into the news cycle with an incident in Northern California. We freshened up the lead to reference that and then accepted it. So that's great advice. Yeah, but to the point, I don't know, Susan, can you speak at all to the degree to which the news cycle has to be respected in terms of op-ed placements?
I'll do that, and I'll also answer the question that came up in the chat about credentials. Perry is a go-to person that people often seek out for editorials and op-ed pieces about China and Chinese Americans and politics. And for me as a fiction writer, but also as someone who's published probably 200 essays and articles and op-ed pieces over the years, I'm a fiction writer, but I'm an expert on, Southern California culture. Also, people will email me. The New York Times emailed me after the initial round of flooding in January when we had superstorms, and an editor from the New York Times reached out and said, we'd like some new views from California. A lot of California op-eds, truthfully, are based in the Bay Area because you either have Sacramento as the capital or you have Silicon Valley. And this editor called me on the phone and she said, we're looking for some new voices from Southern California. And you've written for us in the past about, I've written about fires, wildfires. So a lot of that depends on what our area of expertise is. I'm going to go back, as Perry and I were discussing, the news cycle is really important, as well as what you have that no one else has. So for example, I'm working on 2 pieces right now. One is about Nathan Heller's recent piece in the New Yorker, how the humanities enrollment has really dropped off in terms of STEM surging. I teach great classes here at UCR that have to do with literature, American literature, with current fiction and nonfiction, but I teach great classes right now about how to use multiple languages in fiction. So for example, a lot of our students want to write in Tagalog or in Spanish, or to add maybe some Vietnamese to their short fiction or their novels. And I think this is a valuable discussion to have, is you can only discuss that in a class like mine in the humanities. So I have a lot of STEM, I have a lot of students from School of Medicine, from biomedical engineering, from mechanical engineering, signed up for these classes in current and contemporary literature because they love to read and they like to write as well. So I think that's a great essay that I'm working on. STEM and humanities do not have to be canceling each other out. Instead, they work together so well. And I think we're going to see a resurgence in students enrolling in humanities as they realize how important those things are, even to the STEM fields. So that's one thing that it's not necessarily in the news cycle, but it is current right now. And in answer to the question in the chat about credentials, for me, my credentials would only be, you know, that I'm a fiction writer who publishes a lot and that I teach those things. So let's say that one of my favorite things is when UCR is called upon because of our expertise in entomology, for example. I love that my girls grew up wanting to be entomologists because I taught at UCR. And I loved it when, for example, let's say there's a new version of a parasitic wasp that is, you know, available to help the citrus industry. Those are things that if you're in the sciences, if you're in the social sciences, there might be something that you have expertise in that no one else has. Does that have to be linked to the news cycle? Maybe, and that's helpful, but not necessarily. But for example, if you're going to look at, maybe there's a new development in citrus greening disease. I love the idea that someone from UCR could be right for that. For me, as someone who, along with a couple of my colleagues, I think we're known as cultural critics at this point. I was a editor at large for the LA Times for a few years, and I ended up writing about things just all over the place. The other piece I wanted to tell participants in this webinar about is that right now I've been working for the New York Times with this editor on something about Art Laboe. And Art Laboe is a classic Southern California. He's a hero in Southern California. I was at an event the other night at the Cheech, and my friend Linda Fonseca, whose husband is Jose Medina, who was our first Latino elected assembly member. We were talking about how Art Laboe let people communicate over the years to loved ones in prisons or in migrant labor camps. Art Laboe is very specifically tied to a certain kind of culture in Southern California. The New York Times editor was fascinated by this. She had never heard of this. The point, though, as Perry's saying, is you can't just say, I love Art Laboe, I want to write about Art Laboe, right? Sandra and Martinez and I, we know how Art Laboe is. So Perry's completely right. This piece has been very difficult because what I need to do is get the larger world to understand something about Southern California, which seems very unique to us. And what I realized it is, John, is younger people and a lot of older people listen to Spotify, or they have their Pandora. And that means they have absolute control over the music they're listening to. But people that live in communities like mine play Art Laboe every night on the radio station, and you wait for your dedication to appear. You wait patiently and you hear what everyone else is sending to their dedication. Art Laboe died in October, but his show still goes on and they use the archival footage. So what I think is great is that this now has sort of a larger resonance, right, Perry, is that what do people do when they can't when they can't connect with a loved one in prison? They still write a letter to the Art Laboe show, and Art Laboe's archived as well as the new DJs read it out loud, and that provides solace. So yeah, I think that combination of what Perry and I are saying is it's the same. It's the news cycle is really important. Your credentials are really important, but what really matters is that you know something that no one else does, and you have a lot to say about it.
Susan's a perfect example of how establishing yourself over time repeatedly, weighing in on a topic, and in this case it's Southern California and her own personal ties to Southern California. She becomes a go-to source for which I'm sure probably can really stretch you in ways that sometimes might be uncomfortable in terms of being increasingly come to as this is happening in Southern California. Can you speak to it?
No, but I love it though. And again, two great questions in the chat. To tie it to the news cycle, to going back to what John and Perry were saying about like the first paragraph in the hook. If it's for example, if someone reaches out to you and says, hey, you're an expert on climate change, can you write about flooding in, Central California? Then I think clearly you do tie that, with your first paragraph, which would be like, yes, like recent flooding in Central California, you can do all of those things. But then I think immediately in answering the question that was sent by Uma, immediately you are sort of saying, and this is what I'm weighing in on. For example, like I've written for years on weak levee protection. For example, the Santa Ana River, which is a block from my house, they're doing major work on the levee over the last year. Partly that has been tested by these new floods, but the levee break in Pajaro in Monterey County, that's a huge deal. That would be a great news cycle piece if someone were a specialist in climate control or environmental sciences. And then the second question is also really great in the chat, which was, instead of tying it to a news cycle, can you tie it to a specific month? For example, May is Women's Health Month. I think that's a perfect example of, it doesn't have to be a news cycle, but it's the perfect month to write. So my oldest daughter works for the Fredericksburg Museum in Fredericksburg, Virginia, and Black History Month kills her because she's like, being a Black woman during Black History Month, I'm working all day, every day, having events. But she has made this great discovery of African American history that was not known in Fredericksburg, Virginia, until she was hired at the museum and did some deep research. So publishing something during Hispanic Heritage Month, Black History Month, or as the question in the chat said, if it's Women's Health Month, why not talk about like long-term COVID effects for women and how they might be different for women than men? Those are all great ideas, I think.
Great, and I'm glad that apparently there are questions showing up. Catherine, I don't know if it has something to do with my settings or not, probably not. I'm not able to see any questions in the chat field, so I'm glad there are questions, and I'm glad.
In the Q&A, John, in the Q&A, you can see them.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Oh, wonderful, all right. Technology.
Sorry, it's Alex Espinosa who does the Tomas Rivera conference. He's really good at this, and he and I have learned how to do the looking at the chat right away. So yeah, there's another great question from Margaret. Can you speak a bit more to thinking about how to structure? That's the hardest thing for me. I'm sure Perry has plenty to say about that too. But I'd love to hear what you think, Perry. The hardest thing for me is that we used to have this beautiful form that I taught to my undergrads and graduate student, the 1,200 word essay, you know, and it's a beautiful form, and it can be an essay with a topical hook, like Marty J. Smith, my former editor at the LA Times Magazine, he wrote about his father's suit, that you had to have one suit for all of those things back in the day, like, and his father had his rotary pin on the suit. And that's a very personal thing, but it was about funeral attire and what do you wear to funerals. But the 1,200 word essay, Perry, those are hard now, aren't they? A lot of times the New York Times and the LA Times want 800 to 900 words, right. And that's difficult. So in answer to Margaret's question from me, the most difficult thing for me is getting everything done in 900 words. I just did a book review for the New York Times in February, and it was 700 words, and it was so difficult to say what I wanted to say in 700 right. words. So what do you think, Perry?
I entirely agree. My way of doing this is to get inspired and feel I want to say something and then write it all out. And it might be 2,000 words, which is way too much. And then you go through it and you think, okay, I'm the reader. What does the reader really have to know? And you take out everything that doesn't have to be there and you pare it down, down, down. And then when it's all, and by the way, I don't think I've ever written an op-ed or any essay and then just sent it in. I always write it and rewrite it and rewrite it and rewrite it, usually with time in between. That is, I'll put down everything I want to say, and then when it comes to paring it down to 700 words, I do that 2 days later, because coming back with a fresh eye, it's easier for me to see what I didn't have to say in order to still get my point across. In other words, I can be the reader more easily if I've put it aside for a while. But then the very last level of polishing for me is to make those last 700 or 800 words sound as if I just thought of them. And that's in a sense dishonest to the reader, right? Because I've combed over it and over and over it. But it sounds better to a reader if it's lively in that sense that it looks as if you just thought of it. Yeah. As for structure internally, I think John's original outline was pretty good there. You need some kind of lead to try to catch the attention of a person, and a news hook, as we've said, is a very good kind of lead. But then you say what you think and why you think it, and then you acknowledge that there can be reasonable other views and you sketch them. I'm against straw manning, by the way. It's a cheap shot to take the opposite views that oppose yours and make them sound ridiculous on purpose. And in the long run, that undermines you. Your own credibility is higher if you take countervailing views seriously. So you put them there, and then you indicate briefly, within 700 words, you have to be brief, why you still think your view is better.
I love the questions from Julianne and from Jan Blatcher as well. And Perry, I totally agree with you. The thing is, I write a passionate first draft, and it's almost always that 1,500 word essay that I used to write, for example, for the Atlantic or for Salon. I wrote for years for Salon. And those were some of my most popular essays. They were reprinted all over the world. And that was a different thing, because I think it's good to point out, you have more room in an online publication. So when we're talking about the 700 words to 900 words, these are for traditional print pieces that might come out, you know, in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, or the Washington Post, or some other, the Atlantic print version. But for example, I wrote a really popular piece about when Vin Scully passed away. There were tons of people that wrote about Vin Scully. And you know, everyone writes so quickly, don't they, Perry? You know, like I'm teaching and taking care of my family, and you know, I've got like book stuff, book deadlines. So I can't always write something in a day. I'm always jealous of the people who write something in a day. But my Vin Scully piece was about my mom learning to speak English by listening to Vin Scully do Dodger broadcasts. And that piece ended up being online only. And so it was allowed to be a little bit longer. And that was helpful, because I wanted to bring in all the other people I've met over the years whose parents learned to speak English from Vin Scully. Julianne's question is about lead time, how much lead time? And I think it's a very good question, because again, I think the news cycle dominates so much. You know, you'll see everything about California flooding right now, and then, you know, in May, you won't see it at all. But Julianne, if you have a piece that seems good for May, like a Mother's Day piece, it's really good to get those in early. Whenever people talk, like for example, the editor that I know at the New York Times has been saying she's just overwhelmed with things about the 3rd anniversary of COVID, right? Which is March. But so yeah, if you're going to write something for Mother's Day and that's in May, I think it's great to send it in early, in advance of that holiday. And then the question from Jan is, if you're an expert, but like you don't have a personal, I think her question was, let's say you want to write about autism, you don't have autism, but you have a family member with autism, but those personal anecdotes are what a lot of people want to know about. So let's say that you have a child who's on the spectrum, and there are 5 different ways people are saying you should educate that child. I think you as a mom might be the expert on having tried these 5 ways. And then, as Perry was saying, you might bring in, well, certain experts say this, so that's a really informative kind of op-ed piece. I think there are so many different kinds. There's Nathan Englander just wrote for the New York Times about his obsession with Tom Cruise over the years. And that's very personal, and those pieces are really popular. And then sometimes, as John and Perry pointed out, there's a shock value to something that's happening right now, and people write about that. So there are so many different kinds of things. One thing I miss is magazines. I used to really enjoy writing for big magazines like Harper's in the Atlantic and Family Circle, and their lead times are immense now in the print versions, because they only come out every 2 months. So you end up writing for them online, and there's a lot of content. I think Perry would agree. Like if you're reading a lot of different magazines, there's a sameness to what comes out, like in Vox and, you know, the Atlantic, and you look at it all, and the news cycle goes by so quickly. So that's something for writers to think about.
Let me ask our, let's see if we see other, I think we had a question from Uma about, can the news cycle hook happen in the last paragraph? Better to get it at the top. The editors will prefer to make that relevance to the news cycle pretty readily apparent. Another question that I had was, can you speak to both of our panelists? Can you speak, including from a personal or specific experience, of the potential for an op-ed to influence discourse, but also outcomes.
I mean, I don't have any interest in that because I'm a fiction writer. And like I said, I like to write about culture. If I were to write about Art Laboe, it would be because I want people to understand an entire culture that exists, that is about familia and loving your community and sitting communally with 30 people in a backyard listening to a radio show. So that's more maybe about resilience and about loyalty. For Mecca, a lot of people have written to me over this year, and Mecca has scenes in it where there's a CHP officer who is treated badly because he's Mexican American and he's moreno, which means he's darker skinned. There are passages about ICE, about immigration and customs raids, catching people. But my job as a fiction writer is to tell stories and narratives to make the rest of the world recognize what a singular place I live in, and to maybe understand people more. So I don't ever try to influence any kind of policy. But for other people, like I said, especially those of our colleagues in the sciences, I think it's a great idea.
I am not a fiction writer like Susan, and I do write the kinds of op-eds that are, in a sense, aimed at influencing public policy, especially vis-a-vis China. But I still agree with Susan that when I write, I'm not thinking about engineering somebody else's result. I'm thinking about trying to put the truth as I see it as clearly as I can. I think of a Peanuts cartoon that I saw maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, but it sticks in my mind, of Charlie Brown and Lucy talking. And Lucy says, "My teacher says that teaching is like bowling." And Charlie Brown says, "What do you mean?" And she says, "You roll the ball down the middle and hope for the best." And that's what I feel like when I'm writing an op-ed, even on a controversial political topic like this recent one I've told you about, it, the US perhaps recognizing the Taiwan government. That's a very red hot, provocative kind of topic. But I'm not thinking, how is Antony Blinken going to be reading this, and will he do X, Y, or Z because of what I say? No. First of all, I can't do that. That's too hard to do. And secondly, I write better if I concentrate on what I feel passionate about and want to say clearly, and then what happens, happens.
I love the next two questions, because Perry, they're completely, they go so well with your two opening statements that you gave. Alicia asks about, if you come from a research background, how do you make that kind of language compelling in an op-ed? And I think that Perry's advice to keep things focused on clarity, and also to make sure that it's clear what your opinion is that an op-ed piece, you know, it's not an editorial that the newspaper writes itself. It's your opinion. So if you look at some of the guest opinions that show up in the New York Times, for example, if it's a research-oriented piece, I think the best way to go is to get your general reader, as Perry just said. You're bowling down the middle. So you want people to understand who are experts, but you also want someone to read it and take something away from it. If we're not trying to change policy, we're trying to change people's minds about something, right, Perry, or change the way they look at something. So for Alicia, if your research, again, is, say, I'm just going to use entomology because I haven't had lunch yet, and so that's like what I can think of right now. But if your research is in entomology and and someone's worried about it being too research oriented, everyone wants to see sort of a specific example. And that's what I bring as a fiction writer, is you always bring a great story, right? So let's say, again, someone's writing about parasitic wasps. I think the great story is, how does the parasitic wasp, you know, introduce something to its host, and then that helps an orange tree survive, and that, you know, someone around the world is holding this beautiful dimpled navel orange. The best way is to use vivid, I think, imagery and concrete language in what you can about your research. And then the other great question from Catherine Gudis is, given this widely varying word count requirement or whatever, should you target like a specific media outlet? And that one is, the thing that Perry and I haven't brought up at all, but I think that's really important. I write for places that I read. You know, I wouldn't even know how to pitch something to Vox, even though I just met a great editor at Vox the other night at an event in LA with this photographer that I work with. I write regularly for Alta magazine, and Alta is a print magazine, but also publishes their things online. And this photographer and I did a story about burros in the Reche Canyon. And that was hugely popular. And actually someone ended up going out to Reche Canyon to my friend's ranch and making a film about the burros, which I thought was very funny. But for example, like those pieces for Alta magazine, some of the online pieces are very long and some of the print pieces are very short. So Catherine, to me, you do have to read the places. Like if you read an LA Times op-ed or a New York Times op-ed, you can sort of see that structure that John and Perry and I have been talking about. And you can see where it would fit into about a 900-word thing. Book review, that 700-word book review killed me because that's an even shorter structure. But that's a book review and that's different. I think the beauty of what Perry and I are saying is that you write it long for yourself, right, Perry? And
Right.
then you go back and read it and you think, what can I cut out that I originally loved to keep it down to 900 to 1,000 words. So yeah.
An interest of someone who's in the early part of their career would be to publish an op-ed to sort of spread the knowledge of their expertise in this area, or to spread their reputation in the academic community. So that's what informs this question. What when you've published in the past, what sort of level of acknowledgement or feedback have you gotten for your academic colleagues at UCR and beyond? Do you hear from a lot of folks when you publish?
Yeah, like, I mean, I hear from people all over the world. I mean, I get the nicest emails from my colleagues as well as, you know, readers from everywhere. Like the Vin Scully piece, the Joan Didion piece. The Joan Didion piece, I heard from so many people. And I actually heard from an attorney, a retired attorney in his 80s, who had been in the case that Joan Didion was writing about in San Bernardino. And he had all this information that came out after, you know, the famous Joan Didion piece was published. And so I hear from people a lot. I think it's great. I like to think again that all of us at UCR, no matter what, because I have so many friends here at UCR after all these 35 years, and I love talking to somebody about, you know, the Salton Sea and like trying to retain the essence physically of the Salton Sea. And then I'm writing about people who live by the Salton Sea. Like, I think that's one of my favorite things. Just quickly, there's one last really good question from Elisha Arnold, which is a very practical question. And I'm so glad she brought it up, which is, if you're sending out an op-ed, can you send it out to multiple outlets at once? And that's a really good question. Because especially since we focused on the news cycle, like if Julianne is going to send out this Mother's Day piece that we've fictionally made up, if Julianne is sending out a Mother's Day piece, you know, well in advance, then she has more time. But Elijah's question is good for if you're sending something out, let's say again, that you're an expert on the drought, and this is, you know, some new information comes out related to drought, and you want to send it to multiple outlets. That depends on whether you know the editor or not, is what I would say. If you're sending it to an editor that you know and you've worked with in the past, then you should give that person the courtesy of saying, I'm sending this to you first, but I would have to hear back quickly. That's what I do. So if I'm sending something to my favorite editor at the LA Times about Vin Scully, I say, hey, I'm sending this to you first because I love working with you, but I'd have to hear back within a day because if I want to send it to someone else. So I always try to give people I know that courtesy. If you're sending it cold, that's a tough question, is that you can send it to 5 different outlets at the same time, but then you'd have to really be monitoring it to say, you know, if someone got back to you so that the other people wouldn't get annoyed and be like, oh, you know, I spent time reading this and then you went with someone else. So that's a really hard question. And it's a question that my students ask me about with agents all the time too. Can you send things out to multiple agents? So you have to be really careful. I think if you're sending it out to like the New York Times, the LA Times, and let's say the Wall Street Journal, that you stick with those 3 first, because, you know, if you do those 3, these big 3, I think that helps. if you send it to like 7 different places and you got answers back from 3, then you're really lucky, but you're also, put in a tough position. So Perry, what do you think?
My experience with those big newspapers, New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal, is they can get angry if I send it to more than one. So I send it just to one, and as Susan says, if I know the editor, say, can you please tell me fairly quickly, because if you don't want it, that's fine, but I'd like to send it elsewhere. That's what I do. I don't send to more than one at once, because I have a very good friend, a Chinese lawyer, dissident type named Teng Biao, who accidentally sent his to both the Washington Post and the New York Times at the same time. I say accidentally because a well-meaning friend sent it to one of them. And at the New York Times, they were really angry at it. And the next time we tried to, I translated a piece for him, sent it to the New York Times, and we got a very brusque answer that said, no, this Teng Biao has blown his credibility with us because he did a double submission. So you need to be careful about that. But as Susan says, you can ask for a quick answer so that you can go elsewhere.
I think you choose the one that you really feel the most passionate about, and you ask for a quick answer. And here's one, this sounds really silly, but whenever you copy someone else on an email, like if I send it to an editor that I don't know, or even sometimes the editor I work with at the New York Times, she's so overwhelmed with email that I don't know. But if I copy my agent, there's somebody else on that thread, and then my agent will weigh in. Or if you copy another editor that you've worked with, for example, or something like that, then someone else has seen it and says like, oh yeah, like let us know, or oh yeah, this looks great. So that sounds crazy, but I found that's helpful. I do want to say Catherine Gudis has asked another very specific and really good question in the Q&A. And that is, let's say you want to publish something contrary, like you want to send an op-ed in to the LA Times. Her question is, I'll just read it. I would like to write an op-ed that takes a contrary position to what the LA Times has published as an editorial. Is it a waste of my time? I don't think so at all. The LA Times now and then does this thing where they'll do like 2 op-eds on the same subject, and they'll do like a pro and con. I think, Catherine, if you feel passionate about this, that you should always send that in. Again, we're back to what Perry and I said in the beginning. You should be writing about something if you feel passionate about it. And if you feel passionate about this, what can it hurt to send it to the LA Times? If they reject it, I always tell my students, there are only two answers. They either say yes or they say no. Well, sometimes they say maybe if we could edit it, but the LA Times might say no, and then you might be passionate enough about it to send it to the New York Times. I think if you feel passionate about something enough to spend time writing, 1,000 words about it, that's what you should do. You should say, I realize that the LA Times has published an editorial that is in opposition to this, but I feel like this is a valuable point of view for my community. I think that's always worth it.
Yeah, I entirely agree with that, and would pick up on Susan's reference to the maybe answer. If you get a maybe answer, my experience is that editors are smart people, and they can sometimes see things in my writing that I hadn't seen and be able to improve it. I usually find that the back and forth actually helps. So don't take maybe as a no.
Yeah.
Great. Well, super. Well, it looks like we are at time. A very fast hour, thanks to our panelists. And just want to thank our panelists. Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Perry, for taking an hour out of your day to
Our pleasure.
This discussion. Lots of good stuff here. I'm so glad we reported it. I'm going to go back and listen to it myself. And thank you for the great questions. And I want to thank the behind the scenes people, Sandra Martinez and Catherine Henshaw, who got all this, all the logistics and the promotion together. And thank you to those of you who have attended. And watch for some more. We'll have some more sessions this year. Thank you, everybody. Take
So
care.
nice to see you all.
Good day. Bye-bye.